Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer Fantasy lore, where today we are going to talk about dragons. Who doesn't love dragons? Who indeed doesn't love dragons? They've been a part of damn near every single fantasy setting for as long as anyone can remember, in all manners of shapes, forms, and sizes, some little more than diminutive beasts, to be ruled and dominated by chosen heroes or dynasties. In other universes, dragons are ancient, wise creatures, sometimes malevolent, sometimes not so much, sometimes outright malicious and sadistic. And in the Warhammer world, you have pretty much the entire repertoire of dragons. You have the near bestial creatures, such as red dragons, or more commonly known as fire dragons. These tend to be younger creatures that are very displeased with the state of the world. Either remembering or having been told tales of the day where dragons ruled the entirety of the old world, and they'd like to return to those days. And you've also got ancient, wise, and noble dragons, like the first dragon to ally himself with the High Elves, Indraugnir, and create an eternal bond between his kind and the Elves, all the way up to dragons that are simply solitary and would prefer to live their lives in peace and quiet. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Let's start with the beginning, as per usual. The dragons are one of the oldest creatures in the Old World, having been present long before the Old Ones arrived and began to shape the Old World for their own designs and purposes. Back then, during the long ago times, the dragons were the de facto masters of the old world's skies. They had some competition on the ground from other titanic creatures, such as dragon ogres, for example, but by and large the dragons were the supreme rulers of the world. Then the Old Ones arrived. There are some disputed accounts as to exactly how the dragons reacted to these newcomers, some arguing that they had fought against them, others arguing that they had accepted them. In all due likelihood, the truth is somewhere in the middle. For whilst there were absolutely dragons that would embrace the Old Ones' creations, such as the High Elves, there would undoubtedly have been others who recognized the Old Ones for the outsiders that they were, and swiftly figured out that whilst they might come bearing a tremendous number of seemingly lofty and positive promises, they probably didn't have the world's best interests in mind. And, what with the creation of the polar warp gates and their eventual collapse flooding the world with chaotic energies, the more foreigner-unfriendly dragons would seem to have had the right of it back then. In the heydays of dragon times, there were hundreds of thousands of these noble creatures scattered throughout the world, living probably in their own little fancy dragon societies. But with the coming of the Old Ones, and more importantly, the slight mishaps with the whole polar warp gates, etc., their numbers were severely reduced. The Great War against Chaos claimed the lives of countless dragons, and several others were either corrupted or bound to the service of darker, fouler things. Even many of their ancestors were raised from eternal deathly slumber to wage war against their living cousins. As the dragons had for millennia before gone to a place that is in the current world known as the Boneyards to live out their last few days. driven there by some undying instinct, even as their bodies began to fail from old age or wounds. Turns out, having an enormous dragon graveyard was not a good idea when chaos started overrunning the world, and many of the long-dead dragons were brought back to a semblance of life, at least for a period of time. In more modern days, the dragon boneyards have been known to be frequented by others of a malicious mindset. A handful of very powerful necromancers still know the secrets that can be used to resurrect even old dragon bones, though most don't even stand a chance at resurrecting one of those ancient creatures, as dragons grow larger and more powerful with age, and the dragons of today are diminutive compared to those of yesteryears. Furthermore, dragon bones, even if they have been around for thousands and thousands of years, are still potent, both as weapons, armor, and talismans. The Chaos Dwarves in particular are very, very fond of dragon bones and have established a multitude of outposts in the area, which they can use to mine this precious resource and, perhaps even more importantly, make sure that nobody else gets access to it. But what about the dragons that are alive today in the old world? They can be divided into quite the number of different subspecies. Isn't quite correct, but it's a good enough term for what we're talking about here, as there are many, many different kinds of dragons. Their abilities and temperament often determined either by their surroundings or by the people that they have decided to bind themselves to, or on occasion been forcibly bound to. As whilst dragons are tremendously intelligent and naturally quite independent, a good whipping for their entire youthful lives, well, it tends to break even the strongest of spirits. And so you will have once noble creatures serving such degenerate factions as the Dark Elves, for example. Indeed, dragon eggs are an unfathomably valuable resource to the Dark Elves, who have over the years made countless efforts to sneak into the realm of Kalimdor, where the High Elves, dragons, and their descendants largely slumber these days, in order to try and steal young dragons, or more profitably, eggs of these ancient wyrms. Obviously, the dragons are just as valuable and precious to the descendants of Venerian, and the dragons are protected by tremendous numbers of guards and magical wards, not to mention those handful of dragons that are still awake as well. Still, there's a lot of wealth to be had if a raid can be carried out successfully. And speaking of those dragons that are still awake, one might think that, as there are still a lot of dragons in the old world, hundreds at the very least, possibly even thousands that are alive, that they would still be a major force in the world. Well, there are, indeed, a lot of dragons, but the overwhelming majority of them are deep in slumber. This is as a result of the changes wrought upon the old world by the Old Ones. Once upon a time, you see, the Warhammer world was significantly closer to the system's sun. This resulted in a world that was livable but feisty. Very feisty, to the point where the only creatures that could normally and properly survive on its surface were things like dragons and dragon ogres. Anything less sturdy was likely to be cooked alive, either by the sun's rays, the radiation, or by endless massive storms that once created dragon ogres the size of literal mountains. This was not however, particularly conducive to the Old One's designs, and so they shifted the planet further away from the sun. This made the planet far more livable for an enormously wider array of creatures, which would eventually also see things like humans, dwarves, elves, and the countless other species that now inhabit the Old World. But it was not great for many of the creatures that had originally been inhabitants of the planets. The dragon ogres, for example, drew their powers from the titanic storms that had been wrecking the planet's surface. Now that they began to dissipate, their size have decreased drastically. And for the dragons as well, preferring a far hotter climate, they grew lethargic and began entering into long periods of sleep that at first would last for years, then decades, then centuries, and now millennia, to the point where the oldest of the dragons resting underneath Calador, near volcanic vents and areas underground that are still extremely hot, those truly ancient dragons can no longer be awoken by any means known to the High Elves. And whilst they can still rouse very, very powerful beasts, these rituals take a tremendous amount of time and effort and resources. And even those creatures that can be roused are but pale imitations of the dragons that once roamed the Old World. The greatest of the dragons that have ever served the High Elves, the like of Indraugnir, would essentially have a head the size of a fully grown horse. That is a massive creature, no doubt about it, capable of vomiting forth streams of extremely potent fire. But the oldest of all dragons recorded are said to have had skulls the size of mansions. Even today, there exists remnants of the truly ancient dragons in the Plane of Bones. Ribs so large as to be able to engulf entire ships within them with contemptuous ease. Bones of such size, density, and toughness that they can't even be worked by the artificers of the Chaos Dwarves. It's probably for the better that such creatures no longer roam the earth, or they might decide that they don't want to be the servants of anybody else, or coexist or share the planet in general. Though there are, of course, also countless myths of such creatures still sleeping in the deepest, darkest reaches of the earth, near the planet's molten core. Though these are probably just simple fairy tales and stories, as virtually every single civilization in the Old World have some form of tales about dragons, due mostly to their enormous impact on the world whenever spotted, as even a small dragon is, a cataclysmic event, really, if it decides that a local community is more of a snack, rather than something to be afraid of or coexist with. And there are a fair few of these more predatory dragons around. And I mean, can you blame them? They're giant flying monsters capable of breathing fire or acid or toxic fumes or simply vomiting forth the sheer matter of chaos on some of the more unsavory examples. Why should they not view everything else as snacks or servants or slaves, or simple annoyances when they try to sneak into their caves and steal their fanciful trinkets, as there are indeed a fair few dragons that enjoy creating hordes as well. And it's not like there's much that the dragons can learn from coexisting or working alongside us either. There are many dragons that have a far better grasp of the world than humans or dwarves or even elves do. There are dragons who can control the winds of magic. There are dragons who have lived for centuries and even millennia. You'd kind of need a little bit of a weirdo dragon, really, to even bother with the mortal races. And indeed, more often than not, the weirdo dragons are the ones that bother with the other proper normal races, usually finding themselves a particular group of people that it grows fond of, or even an individual or an area, or they become bound to another civilization simply through their location. For example, the forest dragons of Athaloran. They are obviously bound to the forest itself, and as the wood elves are bound to the forest too, they become natural allies, even if the forest dragons might view this in slightly differing ways than the elves themselves, as there are even those creatures of particular old age within Athaloran that have grown to be more a part of the forest than the real world, developing supernatural abilities. Obviously, the vast numbers of dragons that live alongside the elves of Ulthuan are another example. These dragons bound themselves via an alliance to the High Elves, and especially to Anorion, the great founder of Ulthuan's kingdom. These dragons serve alongside the High Elves as a part of a compact. The High Elves protect the dragons as they slumber. They provide them with their abodes in Calador, and they make sure that they are properly fed and taken care of. For the dragons, this is a bit of a win-win situation, okay? So they need to wander off to war every now and then, but they themselves choose their riders. And war is a fun and engaging little deviation. It's an amusing play, more often than not, for a creature with scales thick enough to deflect bullets. Not really too much of a danger there. It's adventurous, it's fun, and something amusing to engage with in between very, very long naps. Obviously, the other benefits, such as food and protection when they sleep, are also quite nice, especially considering the significantly less comfortable accommodations that a few of their kinds have been exposed to in the deep, dark depths of Naggaroth, the creations of so-called black dragons, who have been tortured and bound to the cruel wills of the Dark Elves. A decidedly unenviable fate. Other dragons may have chosen to coexist with humans because it's easy and because they're interesting. For example, there is a dragon that lives in the Altdorf Zoo. And not just any dragon either, an Emperor-class dragon. Now, the Emperor-class dragons are the largest dragons around. There are very, very few of them. Size is can be a little bit of difficult classification system here. The elves judge them by age. The sun dragons are the youngest, the easiest to rouse, the most impetuous and eager for war. Moon dragons are significantly older, wiser, and tend to be a little bit less interested in the conflicts of the mortal world, and star dragons are the greatest of the dragons that can still be roused by the High Elves. Not only are they tremendously powerful, but their intellect are as valued by the elves as their prowess on the battlefield. An Emperor dragon would be at the very least the equal of a star dragon, and possibly even greater, as these are some of the oldest living creatures in the old world today. And there are very, very few of them living in de facto captivity, which technically the one in Altdorf does sort of kind of do, although in all due likelihood it does so voluntarily rather than anything else. It probably decided that Altdorf was a pretty city, and it would have access to as much meat as it could possibly devour, and it could live in a comfortable enclosure inside of the city. And occasionally a fancy human calling himself the Emperor would show up in his fancy armor and his golden birds and go, "May I ride you?" And that's simply just the cost of lodging. Yeah, it's not necessarily a bad deal. I mean, what's the other option? Living out in the mountains somewhere, where the dwarves are constantly going to happen by and try to murder you with their infernal inventions? Sounds like a lot of bother. You could head north, but then you start running into the servants of chaos, who also have an unhealthy obsession with your kind. And if you go in the wrong direction, then there's the weird elves that have all kinds of sadomasochistic fantasies about your kind. That's not ideal either. I mean, the other elves in the middle of the ocean are sort of kind of nice, but they're awfully stuffy, and they're probably not going to feed you as well as the humans do, because you're the only one they have. And if you head east, well, you run into one of Games Workshop's recent inventions, which is an entire civilization ruled over by dragons. They are unlikely to take your presence as a peace offering. So, it's basically the World Edge Mountains or the middle of the Empire. And the Emperor Dragon residing in the Zoological Garden has decided on the latter. I do wonder if that one's open to viewing for the public. Can you imagine? Here you have basically this hyper-intelligent creature that has decided, and it has very much so decided on its own will, to live in a zoo, to be gawked at by thousands, hundreds of thousands of silly, weird little mortals every day. Maybe he likes it. Maybe that's just kind of his thing. Who knows? Certain other dragons are significantly more solitary. Some by nature, some by ability. You have, for example, things like storm dragons that tend to only live in the uppermost levels of the atmosphere, or constantly traveling around looking for storm clouds, sort of in kind of the same way as the dragon ogres of old. Or frost dragons living, unsurprisingly, in the cold, desolate, far reaches of the north. Now, it's not entirely clear, by the way, whether or not these are different species of dragon, as in that a frost dragon gives birth to another frost dragon, or if they are simply just natural adaptations to the environment, as due to the incredibly long-lived nature of a dragon life, it wouldn't be so weird to think that they might be able to adapt to an environment if they live there for long enough, particularly considering their aptitude for magic as well. And we did mention the Cathayan dragons as well, and I'm hesitant to bring them up here because they are more newish lore, and frankly, I kind of hate their lore, but technically, the dragons of Cathay are the imperial family, where a bunch of dragons decided to settle down amongst the locals and make themselves their rulers. Now, that isn't the craziest thing I've ever heard. Again, bear you in mind, dragons are incredibly intelligent, and so deciding to make a bunch of mortals serve them, because obviously they can, it makes sense. There are certain other dragons as well that have created cults or followings or their own little personal domains in the distant parts of the world precisely for this kind of luxury and comfort. But for there to be an entire dynasty of these dragons that for some reason or another don't seem anywhere near as sleepy as the other ones and can also take on human form, it sounds a lot more like GW trying to embrace the Chinese mythology of dragons rather than the actual dragons themselves. But again, bear you in mind, dragons are very, very magical creatures, and so even if practically no other creature in the old world can shapeshift, with only a tiny number of exceptions, like skin wolves, for example, and that's an entirely different kind of shapeshifting. You know, it is theoretically possible, I do suppose. And it makes sense to seek out servants, not merely for the comfort of it, but also for safety and security. Now, one might wonder why a dragon would need safety and security, particularly the kind that might be provided by mortal servants. But, well, here's the thing. If you indeed do view the mortal races as inferiors, as simple snacks and things to fill one's belly, or producers of shiny things to steal and gather for yourselves, you're gonna earn yourself a lot of enemies. A whole lot of enemies. Enemies that might come looking for revenge whilst you're napping. And with all of the weird and creepy, cranky things and inventions that humans and others have invented over the years, like cannons, for example, the dragons are no longer anywhere near as invulnerable as they once were. There are even, of course, countless examples of dragons, albeit usually the smaller ones, even being slain by particularly intrepid knights. Or more realistically, probably regiments of knights, but you get the drift. And then there's also those leeches, the blood dragon vampires. Yeah. I imagine that's gotta be the absolute nightmare for a dragon. See, the blood dragon vampires are vampires, of course, but their founder of their order, Abnorash, figured out something very unfortunate for dragons. You see, Abhorash was a bit of a combat junkie, an adrenaline fiend, obsessed with finding an enemy worthy of him. And as he was a true-born vampire from the good old days, that was hard. That was very difficult. And so he started venturing up into the mountains in search of dragons. And he found one. A tremendous and old red dragon, often known as some of the fiercest of all of dragonkind. The two fought, and long story short, Abhorash won. And then drank the dragon dry. This was naturally a reaction to the fact that he himself had been torn virtually to pieces during the fight and was severely weakened. But he discovered something astonishing. After he had finished draining the dragon, he no longer suffered from the vampiric thirst. His near one and only true weakness and constant torment had been cured. That was a massive revelation, of course. And Abhorash would go on to found the Blood Dragon's Knightly Order. And the ultimate goal of every Blood Dragon is, of course, to find their own dragon to murder and drink dry. That's a really unfortunate thing for dragonkind, obviously. Furthermore, there are quite a few dragons that are actively hunted by other forces too. In Bretonia, for example, dragon slaying has a long and proud history as one of the noblest deeds that a knife can ever commit. Because Bretonia has been bothered by a fair few rather aggressive lizards over the years. The Empire as well have spawned a fair few adventurers that have decided to try and look up dragons in their abodes for the unfathomably valuable resources that can be extracted from their carcasses. And then there's the dwarves. Holy shit. The levels of racial hatred that the dwarves have for dragons. Oh boy. It is truly remarkable. There are few creatures, other than perhaps the Greenskin and the Skaven civilization in total, that have more grudges written against them than dragons. They've had a nasty habit of invading dwarven holds, attacking mines, destroying colonies, and then there's the little thing about the whole War of Vengeance, where the dragon riders of Calador, the Dragon Knights, were actual dragon knights, and killed a lot of dwarves. Plus, the World's Edge Mountains, home to both the dwarves and a large number of dragons, mean the two are in near constant conflict with one another. The dwarves have figured out a lot of ways to kill dragons, both including gunpowder weaponry, harpoons, and even now, more recently, airships. But traditionally, they perfected dozens upon dozens of specially made runes intended solely to kill dragons, enchanting weapons and shells and all manners of implements to kill the ginormous lizards. The dragons took that personally because, well, this is roughly the Warhammer Fantasy equivalent to a two-handed axe with the N-word carved into the blade. It's the kind of thing that people tend to get somewhat upset about. And thus the dragons, of course, responded in kind, as the dwarves, believing they had done no wrong, escalated. And then the dragon escalated, and the dwarves escalated, and, well, that's pretty much where we're at today. And seeing as both of them are trying to occupy pretty much the exact same real estate, yeah, this particular racial conflict is not likely to end anytime soon. None of that is to say, however, the dragons are particularly vulnerable either. In most cases, mortal servants would be little more than an early warning system, whereas the dragon would still provide the main brunt of the fighting force. Now, a small-ish dragon is still incredibly powerful, but definitely something that, say, 24 heavily armed Bretonnian knights might be able to deal with, and have historically. Additionally, of course, Giles the Breton, the founder of Bretonnia, quite famously slew a dragon too when he was but a young lad. They're powerful, very much so, but by no stretch of the imagination immortal. Even the greatest of their kind are vulnerable, especially to modern-day weaponry or to magic. What makes them the most dangerous is the experience they gain over the years. A truly old dragon is not only larger, stronger, faster, and more powerful than a younger equivalent, but it has learned, probably to its cost, that it is not immortal. See, a dragon, in reality, would fight like the most cowardly little shit you could imagine, swooping up into the sky, then coming swooping down again at a couple 100 miles per hour, spewing flame as it goes, and then shoot off up into the sky again, seeing if it managed to kill whatever it was trying to kill, and if not, it'll simply rinse and repeat until the entire area is charred black. Or hell, simply just char off every direction in which the enemy might be able to escape and allow raging flames to do the rest of the work. Why bother dirtying its claws when it can simply just, well, burn everything to death? Meaning that in most cases, to actually deal with the dragon, you require a lot of soldiers, a plan, and a very specific equipment, usually a literal army. Indeed, the handful of occasions on which a truly mighty dragon have been slain, literal armies have been involved. For example, Skeldrak in Cardine. Many hundreds of years before the birth of Sigmar, he had happened across a gathering of dwarves on the move through the World's Edge Mountains. He had swept down upon them and ate all of them. Unfortunately for poor Skeldrak, one of the little fuzzy creatures that he had gobbled down with such relish was the daughter of the dwarven king Baragor. She had been traveling to Karak to marry the at the time High King. Baragor was not happy with this at all, and went off in search of Skaladrak, discovering him in his lair. The two fought a titanic battle that ended with Skaladrak escaping, grievously wounded, having to leave behind one of its large precious scales in the possession of what would eventually become the Slayer King, as Baragor was never able to fully avenge his daughter. Skaladrak took this very personally, and for over 1,000 years thereafter, it constantly attempted to fuck with the dwarves of Karak Kadren, either raiding its merchantmen or transport, or trying to find some way to sneak into the keep in order to bother and butcher as many dwarves as it could. Eventually, it even managed to get inside of the Karak and exacted a hefty toll of revenge, a petty revenge perhaps, upon the little beardies inside. Enough was enough, however, and the dragon too had suffered grievous injury during its raid. Retreating to its mountain hold, it attempted to stay hidden. But the dwarves of Karak Kadrin managed to track it down with an entire army, and finally managed to slay Skaladrak. So as a point of reference, that is one dragon that was a threat to an entire dwarven Karak, and he remained a threat for something like 2,000 years. Until an entire army finally managed to corner and kill him. So yeah, make no mistake, all dragons are ridiculously dangerous. And the greatest danger to themselves are either from things like dragon ogres, shaggoths, each other, or when they have to rest. Which is again the reason why such a number of them choose to coexist with various other mortal creatures. And with that, I hope you've learned something new about dragons in the old world of Warhammer Fantasy. And until next time, I have, as always, been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.